Jerusalema ikhaya lami ilondoloze uhambe nami zungangishilana Jerusalema ikhaya lami ilondoloze uhambe nami zungangishilana dawo yami ayikholana buso wami awukholana ilondoloze zuhambe nami dawo yami ayikholana buso wami awukholana ilondoloze dawo yami ayikholana buso wami awukholana ilondoloze zuhambe nami dawo yami ayikholana buso wami awukholana ilondoloze zuhambe nami Jerusalema ikhaya lami ilondoloze uhambe nami zungangishilana Jerusalema ikhaya lami ilondoloze uhambe nami zungangishilana dawo yami ayikholana buso wami awukholana ilondoloze zuhambe nami
Good afternoon and good evening. Thank you for everyone for coming. We are privileged because we have a guest speaker today, D.Okai, Senior. He's the founder of the African Diaspora Public Affairs ADPAC Committee, CIC. And I'd like to welcome you here this evening.
Good evening, thank you. That's why we just abbreviate it with ADPAC. It'll make it much simpler for all of us to adopt.
I don't mind, because it's useful to know what you're all about.
Absolutely.
And so if you could sort of explain to us, tell me a bit more about who you are and what you do.
Definitely. So I'm D.Okai, the founder of ADPAC. ADPAC came about as a byproduct of a 5-year journey with a think tank we had called the Solution Room, where we went around the country identifying solution providers who are us specifically. What we normally do is we aggregate all so-called ethnic minorities and say that we are going to advocate for everybody. So take, for instance, Operation Black Vote. It's non-partisan, wouldn't tell us who to vote for, and represents all ethnic minorities. So as a byproduct, you've got these acronyms like BAME, which we get lost in. And that convolution of ethnicities always leaves us at the bottom. And what we didn't realize within all of these years of advocating for black is that black didn't actually mean anything. It was a political term. And if you identify as politically black, anybody can self-elect to be black. So what happened as a byproduct of that is many communities have been usurping resources that should have specifically been black. So ADPAC just recognizes us by ethnicity as opposed to race for who we are. We are African, African Caribbean, and mixed origin people of African, mixed race people of African origin. So if we fall under that as a 3 million population, it's very easy to identify us as an economic group in the UK and advocate specifically for our interests. We just term it African Caribbean. It's a catch-all. We understand who we are as an ethnic group. And within that, we advocate specifically and exclusively for us. So when we say African Caribbean, we don't mean Asian people. We don't mean Chinese. We don't mean Europeans. We just mean that 3 million population specifically. And we advocate within our interests. We lobby within our interests. We educate within our interests. And everything we do is specifically for our ethnicity. So ADPAC came about because we recognize that it requires an institution at a national level. So if government meet under COBRA, which is their emergency organizations, you would have the Board of Jewish Deputies, the Islamic Council, and in absence of African Caribbean representation, now we have ADPAC. So we lobby at a national level to affect the terms of reference specifically for us as a people. And all of this is to make sure that, number one, an institutionally racist Conservative Party, when somebody like Kemi Badenoch is speaking against us or says that Black Lives Matter is a terrorist group, when they have no examples of this and the rhetoric leads to dehumanizing us, we are right there to respond at a national level.
And how long have you been established?
Literally a year as an organization.
And so what schemes do you have to earmark what we're entitled to?
Absolutely. So the first big initiative that we have is called the Schools to Industry Pipeline. That is to create a wraparound care for our young people. And it's a culturally competent public health approach. So what that means is we did a mapping exercise nationally of African Caribbean educators and youth engagement providers that go across the board in every sector that serves young people, from child parent intervention. So this gives a clue to the African lens that we put on things. Europeans, if there's a breakdown in the family, would put social services in the house. Now that isolates the child from the family and immediately brings in the state. Our version is to provide counselors for healing. So child-parent intervention is to really explore what the problems are in the household and then repair them. Now, obviously, if a child is being sexually or physically abused, you go through the measures of protocol to protect the child. But in the first instance, it's to heal the family without state intervention because it's not necessary. So what we found from organizations like Father Figure is that when they go in with a culturally competent approach, it's very easy to create that intervention that just starts a healing between the family, because they don't go in there wagging their finger. It's an exploration of how the family has broken down and a genuine desire to actually heal that. So student advocacy organizations like the Black Child Agenda and positioning them within the framework so that our children are protected within schools. Part of this is championing a law called Jaden's Law. Now, a couple of years ago, a young man named Jaden Moody, who was 14, that had been excluded from school, was murdered by an 18-year-old Turkish young man. And what the law seeks to put in place is to take away the school's ability to immediately exclude our children or place them into PRUs, pupil referral units, without first identifying an appropriate alternative educational provision, which is where we jump in with the schools to industry pipeline. Now, if that becomes legislation, they will have to identify an alternative provision before excluding our children or putting them in a PRU. Now imagine a PRU doesn't benefit the user. All businesses should benefit a client. Now you have a PRU that doesn't benefit the child because they're there as a punishment. They're made aware that it's a punishment and they're not receiving adequate education while they're there. So this is part of the schools to prison pipeline, and we seek to circumvent that. So the first program that we are officiating as of this month with our delivery partner, Crying Sons, is a safe space peer leadership for young African Caribbean young men exposed to serious youth violence. So we are training safe space facilitators between 16 and 25 years old, so they can hold, which will facilitate as well, and pay young people safe spaces where they can come in and speak openly about their experiences as young men. So if we're saying there's a stigma about speaking naked in a room, we're creating the trusted environment where they can come, express themselves, and know that they're safe to express any problems, where traditionally they may be called informers, or where they may just feel vulnerable, but to be themselves and know that there are also adults who are supervising that space outside of those leaders who will fully protect them in whatever they release in that meeting.
And what schemes do you have, for, if any, for young women?
So the program for young men is a proof of concept, which will duplicate and do exactly the same for young women. That was it. We're going to duplicate exactly the same. So this is actually funded by Safer London. We're going to take the evaluation of that and recommend that we do exactly the same for young women. We've already made a number of recommendations about protecting young women, which is around the sexual violence and those kind of things where young men are desensitized by consuming pornography, which we didn't have access to 30 years ago. We were stealing magazines from the top shelf, and now you click a button and you are exposed to the hardest pornography available. So gang sex and all kinds of other things that really dehumanize women.
I don't know if you mind if people are free to unmute and ask you any questions,
Please,
rather than
absolutely.
me trying to read through any comments through the chat.
Absolutely.
So if there's anybody that has any questions, if they'd like to unmute and ask the kind gentleman.
Good evening. brother.
Good evening, sir.
To kind of zone in, what are the main, I guess, one or two problems you see externally that are primary to you at the moment? But let's say looking forward the next 12 months, things that we can practically do and get involved in. The external challenges, I want to distinguish and separate what you identify as external to us and how to tackle that. And I guess internal to us, the challenges that we face internally and how to tackle that, because I come from a position that they are different.
Absolutely. So very much, that's an excellent question. So we separate the internal challenges, and part of what AdPack is doing now, we have a distance learning partner in Knowledge Finder. So as part of AdPack membership, which is £5 a month for ordinary members, we include ongoing professional development and training courses that we put together. One of those that we're putting together is a reparations course, which is specifically for us. So when we talk about our part of the reparations, that is about our psychological and spiritual healing. Now, we have to undergo this in our community, because in the void of that, we see just how bestial our young people become, how more separated they become from us culturally, generation after generation. And based on those huge gaps, we see the surge in serious youth violence, although not necessarily statistically greater than it has been over the course of 30 years. We're just made more aware by mobile phones. However, it is and has been at a level where we can't tolerate it anymore. And we must start that internal healing, which is our reparations. So that's the real internal threat. This goes all the way from how we deal with our finances to how we consume goods and services externally from our community, as opposed to thinking that we would prefer our own services. So when we look at initiatives like Black Pound Day, this should just be a norm, but it has to be encouraged as an initiative on a monthly basis. So in the first instance, and we deal with these issues concurrently because we don't have the time to play catch up where it is 1, 2, 3. So we do release a number of schemes and support a number of delivery partners concurrently. When it comes to externally, we're really talking about Afrophobia, which is the term that we coin just as Jews term anti-Semitism. Afrophobia is the unnatural hate against African people or people of African origin. We see it in the Conservative Party, even in blackface, when they put somebody like Tony Saul or Kemi Badenoch forward, is so that they can disguise Afrophobic racism and still deliver Afrophobic policy that specifically targets us. So in Brexit, when they changed the legislation around naturalization in this country, if your mother wasn't born in this country, you're no longer a UK citizen. And any legal infraction, even civic infraction that we commit, can get us on a plane and deported. By and large, we aren't aware that that legislation changed with Brexit taking place. So you might hear somebody has had such a minor civic or criminal infraction, but is on a plane. So when you see the solicitors go and get them off the plane, it's because they fought that minor infraction, but is based on that legislation. So we seek to have that legislation changed under the Windrush Act. So we champion people like Councillor Anthony Brown, who's bringing forward the Windrush Act. So AdPack specifically fight for and champion all legislation that will specifically benefit the African Caribbean population, be it through Jaden's Law, be it through the Windrush Act, or anything else that we recognize should be in place that will specifically positively impact on us. Because the long and the short of it is, we exist to advance our socio-economic mobility as an economic group in the UK.
Could I ask what you intend to do to address this Afrophobia?
Absolutely. So we work with a number of organizations nationally in that we put out messaging every day. So for us, we create campaigns, and it might be part of a 4-part campaign. So what we'll usually say in our rhetoric is that petitions are useless, marching is useless, going on TV is useless, and then creating legislation or even having our own political parties is useless. In isolation, we will be absolutely correct that all 5 of those are absolutely useless. So what we do is we tie them all together as part of a campaign. So when we ask people to sign a petition, that is so that we have the digital metric measurement to support our case. So anybody that says that's a nonsense, we have figures, tangibles and solid figures from digital measurable metric. If we go on a march, it's to gather hearts and minds, which is the second phase of that campaign. So then visually, we can see our bodies, and spiritually, just like, and I'll just pause for a second and talk about the metaphysics, because as a natural people, we rarely observe the metaphysical components of what we're asked to do. Religion uses the occult covertly. You have African spirituality that will use the occult overtly. Now, when you hold a minute of silence, is to aggregate the spiritual power of a number of people focusing in one direction. So this is what we do for the reparations march, and this is what we do in any march. There are higher echelons of society that understand this esoteric knowledge, that because we're not exposed to it, we don't understand. But there's great power in us aggregating our focused thought in one singular direction. Another part of the campaign is that we make people media aware, because we have to create a balance in propaganda, which is all part of the same campaign. Then we support the We Matter Party with policy, who then go out and advocate on our behalf as well politically. So if you think about ADPAC in terms of just like Greenpeace, being very aggressive in our advocacy, specifically for African Caribbeans, and then you think about the We Matter Party doing that in a political way, who very just gently mirror what we say, just like the Green Party. But the beneficiary for the Green Party and Greenpeace is environmental policy. And we've seen just how important environmental policy is taken, but that's only as a byproduct of Greenpeace and the Green Party. Without their existence, none of us would be talking about environmental policy. We definitely wouldn't be talking about environmental changes or any of this. So it's as a byproduct of very focused and intentional people coming together and aggregating that intellectual capital and experience for singular campaigns where, in terms of environment, the environment will be the winner. And exactly the same in adopting the same tactics and strategies, where African Caribbean interests and African diaspora interests in general will be the winner in terms of policy.
Thank you. That was very interesting and enlightening. Is there Evelia? Would you like to unmute? Sorry
Thank you
if
very
I
much.
said it incorrectly.
No, you've done very well. Thank you very much indeed. You know, I'm so delighted to be alive today to hear someone say the word black means nothing.
Absolutely.
I was at the forefront
Absolutely.
in the 70s, and I will be direct. At that time, the term was West Indian or Caribbean at that time. And people like me were trying to get this point across. So I'm delighted I witnessed today. Let me go straight on to the point. I happen to have a privilege of having a child who is almost 45 years old. She would not identify with Windrush because my background had nothing to do with Windrush. My own parents came into United Kingdom via the Orion. and Liverpool. So I don't know anything about Windrush. So I want to emphasize that if the aim is that a group, two groups, Africans from Africa, Africans from the what I call far West Africa, wants to come together, our issues must be dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
Though you may be aware, right now, what is at the forefront of those of us who are of the geographical area called Nigeria is we want to hold on to identity, including the identity of persons like my 45-year-old. So I won't want them to be getting involved where you're not talking about issues that affect us. What's happening to those of us who you call Africans, but we have nothing to do with the history that you're talking about. So I want to ask you, what really is the effort you have so far put in place, black on black violence? I have a list of 137 young men of Yoruba tribe who lived in London, places like Peckham, all these labor boroughs, and they were murdered in cold blood by another black boy. It's a big issue for us. What is being done about that? Let's forget about all this hairy-fairy. Our women struggle to bring up our children in London, and they get killed by another black young boy who comes from a different world that lacks any knowledge of who we are. What are you going to do about that? What are you doing about that? We want to see end to the killings of the descendants of direct Africa. I have to use that word because I have nothing else to use. Being killed because of their difference in culture. For years, they fool us and talk about youth culture. For a mother who gets a child killed, the idea of youth culture has been a nonsense. What are we going to do about that to stop the killings of our young boys on the streets of London by people who come from the same background that we call Caribbean? I really want us to look at that. It's gone on for too long since Damilola Taylor was murdered. And if he were alive today, I think he will be old enough to be a husband. So that's the truth I want us to face today. What are we going to do? These are important issues. When will the killing stop?
Absolutely. If you're finished, I'll answer your question.
Please.
Fantastic. So first of all, I fully hear you, and I hear the heartfeltness of your message. Secondly, we're past that time and stage in generation where Caribbeans and Africans have a separate culture. The young men have a singular culture, and it's a subculture, it's a youth culture. And that is largely steeped in street culture, irrespective of those who explore it or those who don't. The time of Caribbeans who killed Damilola Taylor is long gone, as disgusting as that was. West Africans, Somalians, and Caribbean descendants are practicing the same culture, unfortunately, of street violence. So when it comes to what we're doing about it is, number one, we took up the study a couple of years ago to identify exactly who were those being convicted of the crimes, who were the victims, what the causes were, and what was being done. As a byproduct of that, as of October, we are releasing a training program for the leadership of young men between 16 and 25, where we are training them as a generational layer of leadership who are peer leadership. So what we do is give them the toolkit to deal with a safe environment space. We give them the media training and then shoot high production media assets for their social media so that they become a voice which is alternative to this street violence, which is being promoted through certain music. And then we have a music project called The Man Who Can't Be Bought, with prominent rappers talking about integrity of men. So this is to psychologically challenge young men to think in a different way. Because if they're receiving their messaging through a very narrow funnel and there's nothing to challenge that, it doesn't matter what we say as adults. How they think and how they act is going to go more along the line of Lord of the Flies, which is where they are. And young men left to their own devices without any higher wisdom than peer wisdom resorts to Lord of the Flies. Those years between, let's say, 14 and 20 are quite bestial for young men in terms of the thinking. They've not reached any maturity by and large where they've had children or seen lives come to fruition. So the thinking is quite selfish. The hypermasculinity can be released by violence and the adoption of violence. So in understanding that, we're creating a generation of leadership to counter that. Now, we have a number of delivery partners, again, who are doing this in those boroughs you mentioned. So this is a delivery that is taking place in Croydon, Lewisham, Lambeth, Southwark, Hackney, Haringey, Brent, and Enfield.
So are you working with Manhood Academy? Is it Manhood?
We work with Manhood Academy, but Manhood Academy aren't delivering on this specific project. But they are one of our delivery partners. And Brother Konsu is a good brother of mine, as is Brother Davis from MAC. So it's very important that you mention that. And because I deal with so many organizations, I'm just going to digress on this part. So we, as an institution, we 100% endorse the adoption of rites of passage. We know that rites of passage should be universal for our young people. So irrespective of whether you're a single parent household or a two-parent household, all of our boys and girls should be in rites of passage organizations, be that MAG, Manhood Academy, Origin HQ, WYLA, or any other rites of passage organization. Now, they all have female counterparts and they all have parental training as well. And for us, we see it like a row of knitting. You could take the children, they learn so much, parents aren't on the same page, you send them home, it's like undoing a row of knitting. But if now you have parental training so that they're in line with the rites of passage that the young people are receiving, it's a perfect ecosystem. And everything that ADPAC do is about executing ecosystems. Everything is based on very simple, highly effective ecosystems that work specifically for African Caribbean people.
May I ask a question?
Please.
Well done. All the boroughs that you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
there are many English as a second language people.
Absolutely.
French-speaking African. The Somalians you mentioned, to an extent, their first language isn't English.
Absolutely.
And of course, there's the issue of the fact that Islam appears to be dominant. I'm not a Somalian. We all know the history, what happened to Victoria Klimby, who was allocated to a Black social worker, and yet language. So, question: how do you cater for the diverse languages that are within the African Caribbean? As I've just highlighted, how do you effectively deliver using their language? Because they have different languages.
Mm-hmm. So the first thing is that when I spoke about that child-parent intervention, we've gone on a mapping exercise with experts that deal with that kind of counseling across the country. So what we're doing at this point is putting that into our ability to signpost and then we'll break down all of those categories. But I'm not going to pretend that we're fully there yet. So all of these things we take in regular public consultation on board, and we'll contribute that. So I'm going to put that in now in terms of languages and language barriers for child-parent intervention.
Thank you very much.
Which also goes into the student advocacy for schools as well. So thank you.
You're just 1 year old, you said. Thank you for making note of that.
Yes,
and I wish
that's very impressive. And
yes,
are you in the process of establishing your own schools?
Is very pertinent that you have spoken about that. So first of all, we also work with delivery partners. ADPAC is an umbrella organization. So we work with organizations that will aggregate all entities in a sector. So take, for instance, the Black Supplementary School Association run by Nia Imara. So by working with Nia and organizations like that, they've already aggregated all of the schools. What ADPAC is doing to add value is we're about to incorporate the first Academy Trust. So there's a teacher named Kay Johnston who created the Diamond Enterprise Academy. Now, she went for a free school license and she was turned down by the Department for Education. What they did was then seek to character assassinate her, which was all very premeditated, because what they planned to do was plagiarize her intellectual property for the free school. Now, that case was fully dismissed this year, having been 4 years in the making. What they have now done, the Department for Education, is fully plagiarized her curriculum for the Diamond Enterprise Academy, which they said at the time was too ambitious for an African Caribbean teacher. And what they wanted to do now, she's been a head teacher for over 40 years. Can you imagine? Now, what they said to her is they can hand it off to some senior teachers of their choosing, and then she could work with them. When she turned that down, they went on the character assassination campaign. So what happened after a 5-hour meeting between me and Kay is that we agreed that we're going to incorporate the academic trust. Now, all of the institutions that ADPAC incorporates from here on in that are specifically for us will all be in sovereign trust. So we have a sovereign underwriter, Paul Simons, whose organization is the First Republic Registration Foundation. If anybody is interested in sovereignty, if you've got a pen, in fact, I'll put it in the chat. So the website is in the chat, which is frrf.org. So you can click on the link or record it as www.frrf.org. Now, the reason we incorporate in trust is because in common law, it lies outside of legislative law. What we will then do with the Diamond Academy Trust is deliver our curriculum without any interference from the Department for Education, very importantly. So outside of just taking Kay's curriculum that she's already designed, we have a number of other educators at the table, because then it becomes a living, breathing curriculum that is improved upon frequently. What we also have is a tech delivery partner within that to deliver the virtual schools through this curriculum. Now, what that entitles us to is the virtual schools money, which is statutory, which is £2,600 per child monthly. Now, this is what enables us to build a robust ongoing concern, which we haven't had because we've failed to form our own structures. We say we're going to form an independent school, there's no funding, so then we struggle. So everything we do is in very simple ecosystems. So this academic trust wouldn't operate any differently to a European academic trust, except that we're delivering an African specific curriculum of our own design and determination.
Right, someone's got their name. Oh, the natural food.
I don't, that's me.
Oh, sorry.
That sounded very, 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 very interesting to me as a concept, but I want to unpack it just to explore it slightly, Dean. With regards to sovereignty, that obviously focused on academia, but I want to extract the legal elements of that, and I don't know anything about law, but from the little I've been told, the maritime area that we're currently in, to the common law area, and how we can then look at holistically at other areas, primarily the legal system, where I think there's a degree of lack of accountability, to say the least, inherently built in the system, or definitely in the application of the law, mindful of Afrophobia. So
Absolutely.
I just really wanted to explore if there's any thinking, if there's any considerations towards having some kind of a court system outside of the existing court system and in other areas outside academia.
Absolutely. So first of all, I know you're fully aware that there are common law courts, and this is why we are forming all institutions inside of common law trust, so that we are now severing our relationship with the state. Now, all trustees of any of these institutions that we set up have the opportunity to become sovereigns themselves. So the superhero protection that we offer to all of those that we work with is personal sovereignty. Now, what we always say is, oh, well, sovereignty doesn't work. So if you think about one man running around London with a 45 handgun, his contract would be cancelled the same day. Now think about 5,000 people walking around London with AR-15s. And it's not that we would have weapons, because that's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about the power of numbers, where now systematically we create sovereign beings who operate sovereign trust entities, where now our vehicles engage with state vehicles, but as sovereign trusts and sovereigns who operate them. So one is made a lord by the Queen. One can also be made a lord or lady by being part of these sovereign trusts that ADPAC is putting together. So we think about the protection under law of our people and institutions in everything we do. And the point of us doing this is to create structural entities to circumvent the effects of racism. Now, when you have to engage with the state under legislative law, you're open to the effects of racism. But what I will also say is, let us not be so naive to think that we can rely on the decency of the state, because they're not decent. So our security has to grow at the same rate as our economics, our influence, and our ability to create these entities. And we have the ability to utilize all of the things that state mechanisms do, in terms of creating our own sheriffs who have as much power as the police, unknown, all common law. So what we are in effect talking about is an alternative system to what is offered now. And remember, in order for the public to engage is merely a choice, where people will choose to or not, but it's not by force. So what we offer is, just like you might say, any organization like the Nation of Islam, people will say, well, if you're not a member, why don't you get the benefits? It's a rhetorical question. We have to be highly intentional about what we're doing from this point on. If we look at the Davos agenda that tells us to roll up our sleeves and pretends that is mandatory, when it's not. Only by them propagating us would we believe is mandatory, and it's not. So what we do is offer the alternative information to let people know that as sovereign beings, everything is choice, including them making a contract with any government entity.
That's awesome. Thank you. Fantastic conclusion, and tied it up in terms of, I think, what I wanted to I guess, explore, and I hope others can take away from. I am mindful of time today. We have gone overboard, so in fact, thank you for having taken the time to do so. Thank you for your patience too at the very beginning of this. I also want to thank, I guess, our participants and guests for their questions and their feedback. I don't know if anybody's got any final comments or final feedback for Dean, but one thing is for sure, this has been way too short, and I think far too less people. And I hope today is just an appetizer, really. We set this for an hour. I'm very short, so people can just strike a chord with people to come back for more. And we would love for you definitely to come back for more and actually do a little bit more marketing so we can get this message out there to a lot more people than is known at the moment.
Well, this is also something that AdPac does. So I know that you're recording this. We're happy to cut it up into shorter clips, which is how people receive things, with all of the details to grow out the Zoom engagement. And I'm perfectly happy for us to do the full hour, depending on what the viewers are taking away. I'm happy because we did start late. So I'm happy to do the full hour. And what I will say is that any questions that you have, just bring them forward, because this is also a public consultation for me as well. We don't have all the answers, and anybody that tells you they have all the answers for us as a people is lying, because they don't have all of the solutions for themselves. So what we do on a regular basis is have these consultations all around the country. So we do aggregate a hell of a lot of information in one place and whittle it down until it's fat-free. And that's how we know that it's ready to be turned into policy. Our job through our directors is to create policy that specifically represents African Caribbean population, and then turn that policy into practice with our national delivery partners. So when we talk about youths and we talk about the early intervention, that looks like rites of passage. We get them from 7 years old, we hold them until they're 13, and we give them all of the tools that they need to become effective citizens for our community. Now, underlying everything we do is to promote, uphold, and preserve our culture. We do that through our media engagement partners. We do that through economics, education, health, housing, trade and industry, and justice.
Do we have time for one more question?
As many as you like. Yes.
Unmute. Oh, I don't know, she's forgotten to put her hand down.
No, I haven't.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Let me say it's good what I'm hearing, in that this initiative is going to enable quality experiences of Africans who are also British.
Yes.
That takes me to, you may not have thought about this, but I think it should be important for for us to be able to have access to our own customary court. And I want to say more about that. Over the years, you see that many African Caribbean men, or let me not use the word many, quite a significant number don't want to stay in any relationship with a woman, and they have children. And this is because of the laws of the country that seems to place the men at a disadvantage. So you may not have thought about this, but I think relationship is the beginning of what I would call good governance.
Absolutely.
And if we don't facilitate cultural sensitivity, if our men don't want to marry, why force them? And if they are going to be married, why bring in laws that basically turns them against the country because they tend to be disadvantaged? Let me go as somebody who is also privileged to operate in a customary court in West Africa. If a woman brings a case about the man having a second wife, it's our culture. We know how to handle it. If the woman is of the mentality that thou shalt have one wife, we know how to handle it. But we don't criminalize the man. By virtue of that, I'm going to stop there. I don't want to take too much of your time, but if we are Africans, if we are African Caribbean, our ancestors have had this type of life that I've described for far too long. And that option needs to be facilitated for those who choose to do so. Right now, it's not being facilitated. You don't have to be a Muslim to have that right. In England, if you happen to be a Muslim, it looks as if they agree that I'll stop there. Maybe you want to respond. It may sound an unusual question to put to you. How do you facilitate that kind of a lifestyle if we want to really be British African?
So we haven't gone as far as to explore polygamy, but what we did in terms of the think tank, which preceded ADPAC by 4 years, is we had public events. So these public events, we had between 100 and 250 attendees physically. We had education, economics, politics, and we had Black Love. Now, within the Black Love events, we had marriage counselors and those who, and psychologists as well. And we recorded these, we put these on social media, we broadcast them live to YouTube and so forth. And the public meetings that ADPAC is about to start in November will be exploring very similar themes, which is economics, politics, education, Black Love, spirituality, where we explore traditional African spirituality as opposed to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So what we do is have people who by clear demonstration are successful in their relationships, give the guidelines as to what they think it could be. But in terms of, and the laws we're talking about will be bigamy, we haven't gone down any of that road. But as I said, I've taken note of the customary courts, which I'm well aware of, and the tribal chiefs, because ADPAC doesn't necessarily work with national leaders, but with kings and chiefs that disseminate. And this is based on our work with the diaspora region of the African Union, which is the virtual region created for the 350 million in the diaspora. So the reason we are called the African Diaspora Public Affairs Committee is because the bigger picture for us and our dual interest is, as diasporans in the African Union, we have representation and we facilitate that effective representation for us. But as far as the bigamy laws and things of that nature, no, we haven't explored it, but I have taken note, and this is something for wider consultation.
Thank you.
Your presentation has been like a breath of fresh air, and you've covered so many subjects and avenues, like you said, that we need to explore a lot further, which we don't have time for. And I really look forward to your next presentation, and you know, your findings as well, to find out what findings you come across with your
Absolutely.
research.
Thank you. Well, what I will say, if anybody wants any further information, go to our website, adpac.net. And if they go to adpac.net blogs, all of this information is there. So if you go to the website and you look at the blogs, a number of different areas that specifically benefit us as African Caribbeans, and all of those initiatives that I've spoken about, the schools to industry pipeline, the safe space training for young men as leaders, all of that is on the website.
Yannick, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I guess one last question for Chief King here today.
Yes, sir.
What two? Can we have you back? We probably want to explore specific areas, probably zone in on one of those specific areas.
Exactly, yeah.
After we've kind of given it a bit more due diligence and see what the rest of our team says. First question.
Please. Yeah, I'm very happy. Number one, I'm very happy to come back. Number two, I'm going to be vociferous in our promotion of the event. And it's always much easier to promote with visual because people know what they're getting. So as you send me this video, I'll chop it up, salient points with all of the links for the intended 6 meetings that are going to go from here.
Beautiful, thank you.
You got it.
This is a massive undertaking, and
Yeah.
I know a little bit about working hard, and I sometimes cover maybe 17 hours per day.
Yeah.
I know that you are online sometimes similar hours to when I am, and that kind of gives me indicative to the amount that you put in, and I don't even know how long for. So first and foremost, thank you for that. But more importantly, what do you do for you outside of this?
So a number of things. This all came about as a byproduct of me running businesses for 27 years. And when I closed my clothing retail in Camden of 11 years on Camden High Street, I made a decision that I was going to take this as an undertaking and just apply my business acumen to our civic services. So I'd already had it as a hobby for 5 years. I was a member of a private members club, and I just used to invite all of these people and spend like an 8-hour day having drinks, conversations on a Monday for about a year. And I had such an inordinate amount of connections from LinkedIn with such a diverse background of expertise, and they were all at the highest echelons of their careers. So you're talking about banking, education, medicine, you name it. I was meeting these people, and this is where all of this education came from, because I was getting a peer education. So what I made as a decision is that I was going to undertake a year to get ADPAC on its feet and make sure that that was successful as an ongoing concern, because sometimes we have the intention and sometimes you have people with business acumen. I don't often find that the two merge. And then that leads to people with ruthless ambition, let's say a Kemi Badenoch, who are just looking for the money, who can be utilized for our adversaries' purposes. And then you may have people who have community integrity, but not the business acumen to actually execute that. So the balance was always the income. So I use the same expertise that I have in doing stuff for a number of organizations. That is the commercial side of it. So in fulfilling short contracts, I take money for that and do exactly what I'm doing for ADPAC. I've also just become an insurance broker, which will be specifically for us in particular areas, like creating life insurance and funeral insurance, like the co-op did, specifically for us, with an undertaking to educate, to make sure that we get a 70% adoption rate, so that we aren't finding ourselves having GoFundMes for funerals, so that we are prepared, because death is inevitable. So all of the things that I do commercially, you rarely hear me promote in person when I'm speaking on these platforms, because at the center of what I want to do here is educate about what we need to do, how we need to do it, who our delivery partners are, so that by and large, if we agree in principle, we can adopt and then apply. Because what happens is, I find when we come forward is there's a lot of conflation, and then when we go the egoic route, we're singing about what our accolades are. Well, I personally know what my accolades are, so there's no need to preach that. It should merely be about disseminating the information and then what we need to do to accomplish what is required collectively.
Do you actually see a time when we will consider ourselves as solely African and not African Caribbean from the diaspora?
110%. So when you hear me say African Caribbean, even this is the first phase in our campaign. Remember, we've been calling ourselves Black, which means absolutely nothing. So the first part of our campaign is for everybody to feel comfortable identifying ourselves as an ethnicity. And remember, there's been this divide and conquer between Africans and Caribbeans to separate us, because then so-called Caribbeans aren't thinking about the African land that we're entitled to when the resources are being raped. And if that doesn't matter, why does the newest nation, Israel, hold 2 years of conscription to protect the land? Because it's all important as part of their sovereignty as a people who went through a 12-year Holocaust. Well, us as Africans have been through just the British component of the slave trade, lasted 225 years. So what are we entitled to? And what should our interest be? Which is why I bring up the diaspora region of the African Union, because we align with State of the African Diaspora region to represent us there. So part of that phase is starting through our propaganda as African Caribbeans, which evolves into the African diaspora, and then we're just Africans, because Chinese don't change irrespective of where they are. A Chinaman in Jamaica doesn't become Jamaican, he's Chinese.
So what about the Aborigines and the people from like
Australia? So they are slightly different, but when we advocate just as much. APAC just had a campaign that said now everybody is in uproar about Australian sovereignty and the mistreatment of Australians, European Australians, by police. Well, welcome to the world of Aborigines, because this is how police have treated them for perpetuity. And how the state is now treating European Australians is how they've treated Indigenous Aboriginal Australians from the inception of that false state.
And aren't we just giving ourselves more labels? We've moved from Black to these other labels, and I feel seriously we need to remove, because that's part of the spell work, is the labeling. That's why they went round the world renaming everything.
Absolutely, I concur. So we're talking about the same thing now when we're talking about our part of the reparations and how we deliver it. So the same way that they would say South Africa and we would say Azania, properly called. This applies to all of our nations. Now, this is part of the lobbying, and Arulu spoke about what are we doing for Africans on the continent. So part of our informing is to create the APPGs, the all-party parliamentary groups, which go across parties that advocate specifically for the African diaspora in the UK, the so-called Commonwealth countries as a byproduct of what Britain has done there, and the CARICOM countries. Now, what we will do on our part is specifically advocate for them. But what we talk about in the reparations is not only the economic part, but also the repair to the bringing back the clock, in returning the proper names, just like I spoke about Azania, and this may go for countries like Zimbabwe, from Rhodesia. So that is exactly part of that repertory process. But for us, we deliver it through education. Please, I can see you got a question.
As part of reparations would be for them to admit that they had failings, serious failings, and for some people they cannot recognize it as a wrong.
Well, absolutely. However, they don't see it as a failing, because what we have to remember.
I was just trying to put it politely.
No, I get it. But in our own house, with our own family, we don't have to be polite. We were enslaved as part of a military occupation. And the difference between the African Holocaust and the so-called Jewish Holocaust is that the perpetrators of our Holocaust actually won the war. So slavery and what they delivered didn't end. They merely changed the names and terms, whereas the so-called Jewish Holocaust ended because the perpetrators lost. So where we will be told to forgive and forget, Israel kidnapped the perpetrators of the so-called Jewish Holocaust, Nazis, and hanged and executed them. Now, when it comes to the economic reparations, they say, oh, the perpetrators are long dead and the so-called enslaved are long dead. Well, let's not pretend that the perpetrators of the Jewish Holocaust are dead and those who were subjected to it are also dead. Should the reparations stop tomorrow? No, because that isn't the nature of reparatory justice. We were underdeveloped, and if anybody has any misapprehension about that, I recommend Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. You'll have absolute clarity about exactly how Europe underdeveloped the progress of Africa. So within that, what we intend to do is set back the clock to put all of those things in place so that we catch up. A huge part of that is economic. Part of it are the terms and names of reference, and part of it is our own psychological and spiritual reparations, which is the part that we deliver to ourselves. Now, that is all to be done concurrently because we don't have the time to play catch up.
And you can see that being done willingly.
Willingly by them? No, no power capitulates by choice. This is all about how we form. Now, even the economic reparations by Germany and all of these nations like the United States, who give $3 billion in military aid, wasn't done willingly. It was all done by sophisticated manipulation. And we're going to have to be equally as premeditated as the Ashkenazi Jews were to acquire those reparations. No power capitulates by choice. Anybody who tells you they will is either an imbecile or a liar, or a culmination of both. However, no power concedes by choice. Not us, not them.
They consider their gains as spoils of war.
Absolutely. And we will have to force them by the sophistication of our organization. So I'll end on this point. Power isn't numeric. Now, we are 1.5 billion people globally who think with a number of different frameworks. Power is organizational. So when we look at the organizational structures that Ashkenazi Jews utilize and that Zionists utilize, there is a central base through which they represent their interests. State, ideology, through Zionism, and if we do not adopt structures that specifically represent our interests that will benefit our state, then we in the diaspora aren't even of any value to our people in the African states. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So when we organize in a specific and particular way, we then create the power that is required to force our adversaries. into particular positions to capitulate.
But what concerns me is that we're trying to build on an existing framework instead of just doing away with that and creating our own.
But ADPAC isn't building on any existing framework, and it's completely of our own design, which is a living, our manifesto. The first point of our manifesto is reparations, and that is a living, breathing manifesto. And our constitution is such that only people of African ethnicity can join. So there is nothing that is existing about what ADPAC is building. This is completely of our own construction, and it is a new framework and is based on African sovereignty.
So who would determine African sovereignty, as everyone claims that they originated from Africa?
Melanated African people is the definition. Now, there are several definitions of what makes an African person. Now, we may be British citizens, but unbeknownst to David Lammy, we aren't English. That is an imbecilic wish. I want to be English. You're not English. English people are ethnically Anglo-Saxon. We are African people who are melanated Africans. So would Charlize Theron be an African under ADPAC definitions? No, she would not. Would Elon Musk be an African under ADPAC definitions? No, he would not. It requires a perfect suntan.
I can't wait to see how this episode will unfold. Thank you again, Brother Dean.
Thank you for the opportunity.
I think we could have gone on, and there's usually a lot of questions that will come out of conversations with you, I suspect, going forward. Thank you again and again. Thank you, Sister Aurelio. I really enjoy your questions as well as your tone of voice. I think it carries a certain degree of wisdom that almost reminds me of my mother. So I
concur.
I appreciate that too. And Sister Dawn, for your hosting today, much appreciated. Thank you again, Dean. Looking forward to seeing you again. I will, once we get this uploaded, I will share it with you to cut pieces as you see fit. And hopefully we can arrange another time very, very soon.
Thank you, family. The platform was appreciated.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night, family.
Good night.